Patrick Klepek is a games journalist who throughout his long career has worked for some of the most important outlets of the 2000s. A few weeks ago I caught up with Patrick to talk about his career and how he got his start. This is the second part of our discussion. The first part, focusing on gaming news and how the industry works, is live now on the channel for you to watch. Please bear in mind that this was recorded some weeks before the news of the departures of Brad Shoemaker, Alex Navarro and Vinny Caravella from Giant Bomb. We at Overlode would like to wish them the absolute best with whatever comes next and thank them for their years of inspiration and tireless laughs. Without further ado, Patrick Klepek. Patrick Klepek, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So there's a lot to go through. For someone that's still pretty young, you have had a career that is so long that it took multiple nights of me going through multiple different wikis to work out exactly where you have been. So if you want to give us a quick summary of how you got your start in games media.
Yeah, it's a weird story. A lot of confluence of luck in the right place. I grew up in kind of like in the 90s. I got the first computer that came into our home, pretty soon had access to the internet and I was pretty taken by all that. And, this was an era of GeoCities, Angel Fire, like basic website building on the internet. And I learned how to code very basic HTML. It's like, look, frames, no frames. If you were old enough to remember what it was like on the internet where you could pick between those different places, it basically meant there was a column on one side and it sounded much fancier when you labeled it frames. But I was, being a young kid, I played a lot of video games and was like, oh, well, I'll build a video game website. And so as far as I can remember, because that is fairly old even for me at this point, I'm pretty sure I just plagiarized the magazines that were in front of me. I was like, well, I'll just copy these magazine words or whatever, brief back when IGN was like the Imagine Games Network, which is where that acronym comes from originally before they were acquired many ages ago. And that's kind of where I started. So then I started hanging out on various video game websites. I somehow became attracted to a website called Gaming Age, which attached to Gaming Age was something called the Gaming Age forums, which GAF or NeoGAF were like very popular gathering places for a number of years for game fans and kind of insiders. And attached to that were a number of folks that hung out in an IRC channel called VidGames. And I just, again, picked a handful of random places and then ended up in these different communities. And it turns out that IRC channel was where a lot of people who both wrote for Gaming Age and then would later go on to write for EGM just hung out. And so I just found myself in a chat room with a bunch of current and upcoming EGM editors. And then the wild coincidences continue. I lived like 25 minutes from where EGM was made at the time, which was out here in Illinois. They later moved out to California around the formation of OneUp.com. But for a long period of time, they were made in the suburbs of Illinois. And I came to know those people close enough, despite being 14, 15, that they would let me come to the EGM offices and hang out. And some of them are like really close, lifelong friends. And as a result of just like knowing these people and then becoming my friends, like that ended up tracking with going to high school, not knowing what I wanted to do, having a teacher pull me aside and say, what do you want to do? And I said, I don't know. Great question. And they said, you seem to have a talent for writing. Why don't do you want to write books? I was like, no, I don't, none of that sounds interesting. Like, well, journalism is, at that time was like a very credible path to like a good paying job. There was like a lot of jobs in that, and that was like a career you could go on. And so I got involved in the high school newspaper. And from there that was like, well, I need to go to college, I guess. What am I, spin the wheel? Journalism. I will go to school for journalism. And so that's around the time when I kind of, I formally went and, picked up a lot of the tools of the trade formally in school. And that tracked with a lot of these people I knew who were working for EGM. They started, suddenly I could put words together enough that they would allow me to actually get paid to write them. And so I was contributing reviews and some like basic features to a lot of like Computer Gaming World and EGM and GMR, XBN. I'm like trying to remember some of these like magazine names that I can't remember anymore. But like that's kind of how I got my foot in the door, was through the really just a wild coincidence of contacts that then led me to like picking a degree. And when One Up was started around that time, I was graduating college when Luke Smith, who now runs Destiny, but at the time was the news editor of One Up, asking asking David Jaffe, like, why are you sending what was it, some game to fail? There's a very famous quote he had around the PS3 launch. But regardless, he was leaving to go join Bungie around the development of, I believe, Halo 3, and the news editor position showed up, and they said I had planned to like spend the summer at home after college, and they said, if you want this job, come to California. And so I did, and that was kind of like the beginning of the professionalization of my career. Was all that.
Brilliant. Do you remember what the first article you were paid for was?
Boy, I don't know. So I don't know that I was paid for an article specifically. So I got involved in the management of Gaming Age as a website before I was writing like professionally for any of the magazines that were then published by Ziff Davis, like EGM. And so I was definitely writing reviews, but I can't remember if I was paid on a per article basis or it was just like I think it was just a general like monthly payment based on the ad revenue. But what I can say is that when the money showed up, my parents looked at it and went, that is far too, how old? Like they had thought what I was doing was they liked that I had a hobby. They were a little concerned about how much time I had originally been spent playing video games and then was now spending on the computer related to those video games. And they knew that I did know people, but they hadn't really grasped a sense of like what that meant. And then I started getting, this might be apocryphal, but in my mind, it was like I was like 15 and I was getting roughly $500 a month, which was just like too much money for a 15-year-old. And they took most of it, invested it into college, and then like gave me, I don't know, like $100, which was like still plenty for me to buy whatever games I wanted on a monthly basis. In addition to like the occasional free thing that I was getting from the website itself. So that's kind of where it started, was partially funding my later college years by getting paid too much as a 15-year-old. Yeah, so it was interesting being at One Up, which despite having contributed to One Up for a number of years as a freelancer, I was doing a lot of news before Luke Smith, Jane Pinkard, who was famously sang the One Up Show theme, and was a co-showrunner of that. She was the first news editor that One Up had, and I was an intern that summer, and so that led to then, over my years at college, like writing a decent number of news articles for One Up, and eventually working under Luke Smith. And that was all an era where like the notion of games journalism was like the idea of like people calling themselves journalists was like a fairly new concept. It's not that people didn't necessarily say, oh, they're a games journalist, but the idea of like folks ascribing the term to themselves and taking that seriously. It was more that there were a lot of games writers, and occasionally they did games journalism by happenstance. Not that there wasn't incredibly good work being done, but I don't think a lot of people self-identified as that. There wasn't really a whole sense of like challenging the system. And that stuff started to develop around that era where games criticism was growing up and modernizing and taking itself more seriously, and games journalism was kind of in its earliest forms. And so to be around, someone like Luke Smith, who was very aggressive, who was very pushed back quite a bit, in a way that the reason he was so popular was because he really didn't take any shit and was like very happy to dish it out. It was an interesting time to have kind of figured out, I guess this is what I'm doing. Like I thought I was writing about games, but what I'm actually falling into is being a games journalist. And that ended up being like a very accidentally shrewd career move, because often what people are looking for is traffic, and writing news or features is often was not necessarily what everyone was putting their hands up to do. A lot of folks were, I want to write about video games, I want to do previews, I want to do reviews. That was more the flashier part of folks wanting to get into that sort of like paid side of the industry, where I was saying like, I can do news and features and interviews, and like that made me kind of unique. That is less so now. There are all sorts of people who do it these days, and many who do it much better than I. But it did make me sort of unique, and it's part of what contributed to me bouncing kind of all over the place. Is I was lucky enough to have folks that were interested in having me along on the things they were building. I mean, really, it was like when I was only at oneup.com for 6 months officially after I moved to San Francisco, and I got a random phone call from Steven Totillo, who was working for MTV at the time. He's now at Axios, was the editor of Kotaku for a number of years, and he said, "Do you want to come be the West Coast editor for MTV's games division?" And like part of when I conceptualized what my career path was involved. Like it would be neat to write for sort of non-enthusiast press, to be the games person at, I don't know, the New York Times or something like that. Like as I thought of like, what could I be doing in my 40s and 50s to justify doing this, for X number of years. And that's why I jumped there. And unfortunately, like there's not like a sexy story on like why I went to G4 after that. It was more the 2008 financial crisis happened at MTV. I was what they called a permalancer. Which means that I didn't have a salary. Like I negotiated a salary, but I was paid hourly. So the hourly rate was figured out by whatever you had figured out, whatever you determined the final number to be. But it also meant they didn't have to pay you benefits, which is why that contractor status existed. It was like, well, we pay you a salary, but you're not going to have a 401k or healthcare or any of that fun stuff that you normally. It's a job, but like it's not a real job. It's going to demand all your time, so you can't do things on the side. But going to the doctor is going to be an issue for you. And so when the financial crisis happened, I was like the first to go. The permalancers were the first to kind of get cut. I was fortunate that Totillo at the time got wind of it about 2 weeks before they were going to tell everyone, and he was like, "You should probably look for another job." And that kind of ended up leading to how I found my way to G4 and the launch of their website not too long after.
I certainly get that element of the writing about games for traditional media. When I tell people that I do work for the BBC, they immediately think that it's some kind of like important news or documentary stuff, and I have to go, nah, I just review games. It's like you'll go on the BBC homepage on, say, when the console embargoes lifted late last year, and it was all this really serious stuff about the pandemic and things like that, and then just in the corner there, it's like, is the PS5 good? It's like, makes me laugh every time.
Similar. Well, for me, it's often everyone, my family thinks I make games. I wish I could point, at some point I just started making up the games, like, oh yeah, it was, I worked on that new. You heard of Call of Duty? Yeah, I'm part of that. Like it's just fine. Whatever. That's close enough for me.
Yeah, the worst thing I ever did was let an extended family member who quite likes games know that I got a review copy of a game, and that translated in their head as I just have this infinite library of every game that anytime they want a game, they're just like, oh, do you have a copy of that to send over? It's like, no, not how it works.
Yeah. Also that you play games all day. It's like, no. Actually, I functionally do all sorts of unpaid overtime in order to. I get not paid to play games at night, so I can get paid to write about the games I didn't get paid to play during the day.
Yeah, maybe one day this job will actually be what people assume this job is, but not yet.
I think it has gotten a little bit better. I think there are places like Kotaku that have tried to formalize policies here. At VICE, we formalize. We don't have it's not written in an employee contract. I recommend that places do that so that, your employers have to stick with it. But we do like enforce that if someone is working evenings to, say, finish a review game, that you are comped, some measure of time that is like, no, just like you actually get, 2 days off because you hustled on Cyberpunk or whatever.
Yeah, especially when stuff turns up 24 hours before it's going to come out, and you're like, well, we have to have something on this. It's the biggest game of the year. You have to just do it. So, I mean, it's a ridiculous thing to complain about, but I think the next the place where I think a lot of people probably discovered you, certainly where I discovered you, and something you're probably sick of talking about is when you got to Giant Bomb.
Mhm.
What was that time like from your memory, and how did you get involved with those guys?
One of the people who was in the chat room when I was extremely young was Brad Shoemaker. He was tied up in that group. So I've known Brad for an extremely long time. He was a friend long before he was like a coworker and a colleague. And so it was like deeply surreal to at one point like merge those worlds. It's like, oh, I guess we work together. Brad Shoemaker, who I remember talking to when I was 13 outside of the Duke Nukem Forever booth at E3 1998 in Atlanta, Georgia. So I'd always kept in touch with Brad. We like weirdly went like separate. Like he went to go work for GameSpot. I went to go work for One Up. And he, I think he was an intern at GameSpot before he actually worked as a staff there. But in any case, uh, so I kept in touch with Brad. When I was at G4, then there was an opportunity for me to go to the new EGM, and specifically the pitch there was, hey, you could be kind of like the EIC of the digital magazine. It's going to be like iPad only. And yeah, that all stuff seems like kind of goofy in retrospect, but was like really exciting at the time, potentially like, maybe this is the future of publishing and yada, yada, yada. And so to like actually be in a leadership role for a magazine that I was so influential to me as a young kid was just like immensely exciting. Plus I had a bunch of friends that were getting hired as part of that group. And it was like, cool, I'm going to go work with my friends and try and build this thing. And that didn't go well at all for a myriad reasons that aren't even worth getting into. And then also are like, I still sort of think that I could get like sued for at some point because of some of the people that were involved there. But like, needless to say, I didn't enjoy the experience and fairly quickly was trying to find a way out. And I didn't really know where I wanted to go. And so I was kind of trying to think through like what makes sense, like what would be something kind of different. And at the time, I realized, I was thinking, okay, I do news and features and interviews. Like, what is a place that isn't doing that maybe could benefit from that? And I looked at Giant Bomb and I was like, oh, like they're doing podcasts and they do reviews, but that like they don't do any news. And my guess is, as a small site, like they might be interested in like cheap traffic, and like news is often a relatively easy, cheap way to kind of like increase the traffic on your website because it's always like the relevant thing that's happening that day. So I have an email buried somewhere like that I sent to Ryan Davis and Brad Shoemaker that was just like, yo, like, have you thought about doing news? Like, I'm trying to get out of this shit show. Could I do news for you? And they hadn't really thought about it, but they were interested in the idea. And the original idea was that I was going to stay in Los Angeles. And because my wife worked out there at the time, and I had been out there for working at G4 and for working at EGM. And so the idea was like, well, like Giant Bomb will have its thing out here in San Francisco. Patrick will just run some sort of like newsy thing in Los Angeles remotely. And that'll be how they expand Giant Bomb. Well, my wife wanted to move back to San Francisco. And so we ended up finding ourselves in San Francisco. And so then I ended up coming to the office. And it was like deeply unclear at that point, like how I was going to integrate into any of this. Like there was no, even in like the preliminary meetings, I was interviewing with everybody. At no point was like, okay, well, we'll have you on the podcast or in videos. Like no discussions about like any of that. It was more like I just awkwardly showed up, kind of started doing my thing. And then I remember one time, like Ryan Davis being like, well, we should have you on the podcast. Like, come on the podcast. They didn't have enough mics for me. So the only time I could be on was when somebody else was out. And so eventually there was like an equipment order that like allowed me to be on at first more frequently and then eventually full time. And I remember doing my first, quick look with Ryan. It was just sort of like, hey, you want to come do this? Like, okay, sure. I think partial of that was attributed attributable to the fact that they had this core group that was the appeal to their really dedicated audience, and they were both naive and had not really thought through like how do you add like a person into that mix. And so, I look back on that time with fairly mixed feelings. I had not really like kind of blossomed into like, what is my personality on a podcast and on video? And so as much as like at times like the Giant Bomb audience, who can be very touchy, was extremely hostile to me in ways that were wildly inappropriate, and I wish had been like handled by the other staff or addressed in some way instead of like just allowing it to fester. At the same time, like, I have the distance to be like, yeah, I was probably kind of annoying, trying to speak too much, trying to keep up in a way that I can see why that would have irritated people. I'm not like saying that to excuse like, harassing behavior, but I essentially came into my own in a different format people often say, boy, when you get older, like you wish you could go back to college, like with what you know now and like how you'd actually pay attention instead of like, just getting drunk all the time. And like, I think now is like, man, now that I better understand how I like what my interests are, what my strengths are, what my weaknesses are, how I fit in with group dynamics, what I'm good at, what I'm bad at. I wish I had known that when I was at Giant Bomb, because I think I could have like done more interesting work and fit in better. But it also forged me. Like I wouldn't have learned that stuff without that trial by fire. And so the 4-ish years that I had there, I treasure. I attribute a lot of my success in my career just in terms of sheer visibility to that time there and everyone there, including our past Ryan Davis, RIP. They're all incredible friends of mine, still are, talk to frequently, would kill to work with them again if somehow things came together. So yeah, Giant Bomb, it was awesome. Like I had a great time. It was an awkward time, but it was a really great time too.
So that's an interesting perspective to me, because as someone that's still deeply in that community, I feel like the community thinks of that era specifically as like the golden era for the site. Like that kind of like especially when people talk about the podcast, people always talk about re-listening to those years of the podcast, that it was that group, like yourself included. And to hear that the community wasn't as well, it was like straight up abusive at times, is very surprising. But I suppose it's the kind of thing that,
well, it's also like some, like what is, capital C community? No, like lower C community.
yeah,
yes. Right. So the kind of people that are like rushing to, the comments of a video to be like, oh, like this one has Patrick, I wish X had been on it instead. Like how much does that represent the whole community? Like it doesn't. But
yeah.
there was, and how many people enjoy things but don't say anything. And so I certainly don't mean to paint with an overly broad brush, but I think if you were to talk to certainly any member of the Giant Bomb community that was like active in their comments or message boards, the reactions that different Ryan, Jeff, Vinny, Brad people often got was like, I was not alone in that. Like that happened to Austin as well. That happened to Abby. That happened to Alex. Like it was very common for like, because that group had this very specific core, the deviation from that, the community did not always take kindly to. But because I was the first full-time hire, that it just happened to me more frequently.
Yeah. So you were with the team when they eventually went back to CBS and that kind of the acquisition. What was, from your perspective, was there a shift in how you saw the running of things when it stopped being Whiskey Media and became CBS? Because it wasn't massively long after that you left. So how was that kind of era for you?
It really was no different. It was funny when we got bought. They put us on the same floor as GameSpot, which made sense. Like put your games teams near each other, but they didn't tell us where we had to sit. And we ended up, I can't remember how much was conscious and how much was just, it ended up working out that way. But we, rather than get like thrown into the pit with them, like attached at the hip to their desks, we just like found our way into this one corner away from everybody that was near a bunch of empty or sort of like kind of like a conference rooms, but like there are little rooms where like you could take a phone call and like shut a door. So basically like we were kind of sequestered and people left us alone. That was for better and worse. If you're going to get acquired by a big company, you would want the resources of that big company. Like that's part of the sacrifice you're making, is like, all right, if I'm not independent, like give me the money to do more stuff. And that didn't really happen. That some of that changed after I left, and there were, executives cycle through and realize we should try to do something with that giant bomb thing. In terms of what we did day to day, like pretty much nothing changed. Some people made some money as a result of the sale, but in terms of the like day to day, not much change. But it was also a much cooler atmosphere at Whiskey Media because you were in this basement with a bunch of weirdos building a bunch of strange websites and not really knowing where all this was going. That was a really exciting time. Like being in that basement with everyone attached to a bar that eventually, like there was an actual, like it wasn't like a bar open to the public, but there was like a bar space that had some arcades and there were taps attached to it. And eventually they had to shut that door and like tell people to not go in there unless there were like formal times had been declared for drinking. Like nothing terrible happened, but it was like a little too much casual, like, let's go get a couple of beers were happening. But it was just such a weird atmosphere that I will never be able to replicate. And I'm very fortunate to have been a part of that time because it forged a lot of really critical friendships.
So I guess the question now is, why did you decide to leave? Because it's from the outside, especially from other people kind of in games press that are around my age and were around, like, I was in high school when like that kind of era Giant Bomb was happening.
Mm-hmm.
That was like the pinnacle of like 5 mates messing about with this cool office, building websites, and like being kind of not being sell out games press, like making fun of everything. Like it seemed like the absolute dream. So at what point were you like, I need to move on from this to further my own career, or because you wanted to achieve different things?
Yeah, so there was a critical so during my time at Giant Bomb, my dad passed away, and that sort of accelerated a timeline with my wife and I of moving back to the Midwest, where we came from. We both grew up in the same area, just outside of Chicago, Illinois, and we'd always intended to go back there, but we didn't. We had like it was a really fuzzy timeline. It was like, at some point it'll all make sense. And then when my dad passed, it kind of put things in perspective, and suddenly it's like, oh, maybe we should get married a little sooner. Maybe we should, have kids a little sooner. Maybe we should move back a little sooner. And so we had set a deadline after my dad passed of wanting to move back a year from then. And so when I knew I was moving back, I remember I had a conversation with Jeff when I told him I was leaving. I was like, hey, you should, if you want to, you should like, take my salary and hire someone local. Like, I don't want you to feel that because this is a small, tight-knit group that you should like let me keep this job when I'm going to, kind of break up part of the reason I was hired to, like be in these videos and in a group dynamic locally. And he said, no, he said, just move and we'll figure it out from there. And I think part of the idea was that as people got older, Vinny, I think he had his first kid around the same time. There was a recognition that the website would probably have to change at some point anyway. And so letting me move and trying to figure that out and how I fit into things just kind of made sense. And so I did that for a year-ish. I can't remember exactly now how long that went on, but I was doing a lot more writing. I like experimented with doing, remote quick looks either by myself or with Alex Navarro. We did the Bomb in the AM with Scoops and the Wolf podcast. So where there was like morning content for the fans. There was a lot of really fun stuff we did at that time. But at a certain point, I didn't really like doing all of this content by myself, and I missed like working with people. And it kind of seemed to me that Giant Bomb they weren't going to let me go. Like they weren't going to like say, hey, Patrick, actually, we think we, could do something else with this position. And so I don't know. It literally came up where I had messaged Steven Totillo at Kotaku and was like, I haven't really like thought this all the way through yet, but I'm kind of considering doing something else. And I was not fishing for a job. And he said, well, that's really funny. I literally just had a meeting where they told me if you'd like to make, like a big hire or two, here's the money, go do it. He's like, well, I could give you an offer letter in a day or two. So I was like, oh, all right, I guess like this has been answered for me. So like it accelerated again, like in another moment would accelerated my timeline. It's not really what I meant to do. I probably would have stuck around for, who knows, maybe I still would have been there. I don't know. Like, 'cause I really wasn't actively looking. I just confided with a friend that I was considering it. And then, boom, something came together. And so that was where we amicably split ways. And I think it's been, the better for it. Like I wouldn't be here, doing what I'm doing now if I hadn't left, which then led to Austin Walker, Austin was hired when Vinny went to New York. Part of Vinny going to New York was like, I left and like proved you could leave and things could still work. So like, there's all these like kind of dominoes that happened as a result that, I think Giant Bomb was better served by having someone like Austin around. Like we ended up, meeting as we were friendly online, but got dinner at a PAX after he'd been hired. And I was like, hey, let's have dinner. I want you to, explain the weirdness of Giant Bomb as a place. Like, just if you have any questions about working there, I'm happy to, level with you. And then we came away from that dinner going, well, this sucks. It really would have been cool to work together, but good luck with Giant Bomb. And I was off to work at Kotaku, which itself was a very satisfying experience. I did a lot of my favorite pieces that I've ever been a part of during that year and a half or so. But yeah, it was really just kind of felt I had reached the end of the natural lifespan of that job. And my ethos on changing jobs has always been, am I going to get to do something new? Am I going to, the moment I get too comfortable, I want to go try something else. My mentality on that has completely switched now that I have kids, and it's more about comfortable is the place to be. And then you should just try and do interesting things within that framework. But that's what motivated me when I was younger.
So you next spent some time at Kotaku, as you said. It was probably one of the shorter reigns you had, because you spent so much time at Giant Bomb, and then obviously following that, the Waypoint VICE stuff has been going on for quite a long time. So how was that time at Kotaku, and what motivated you to eventually move on to forming Waypoint with the previously mentioned Austin Walker?
Well, Steven has been responsible at multiple sort of instances in my career for, he kind of plucked me out of nowhere to come work at MTV. And so when he went to go work at Kotaku, part of what I was thinking about, what do I want to do after Giant Bomb, was I was glad for my time at Giant Bomb that I kind of learned how to podcast, how to do videos. But I certainly, if I was making a list of things that I'm best at, like it's not what I would put in my top three. It's like, I know how to do this. I can do this, but I thought my strength was in writing and reporting. And at Giant Bomb, I was kind of the only one doing that. I think, people like Jeff who do a lot of E3 interviews, and like a lot of journalism was also happening, but it wasn't a bunch of journalists constantly thinking about how do we do journalism. And I was excited about the prospect of going to work with a group of writers where that's what we were thinking about every day, was how do we tell interesting stories? How do we help one another tell interesting stories? How do we challenge the industry? How do we break big news? And that sounded really exciting to me. And that was an era where I got to, before, Jason Schreier became the big shot that he is now, I was, constantly working alongside him, kind of running the news team at Kotaku. And yeah, so I got to work on just a lot of really big, complicated, weird pieces that allowed me to kind of stretch these muscles that I hadn't done nearly as much at Giant Bomb. And really, if Giant Bomb was a time when I sort of like figured out what my strengths and weaknesses were, in video, like Kotaku was a moment when I sort of refined who I was as a writer and a reporter, and kind of honed my skills and my voice there by having really, strict and stringent editors who really pushed back on my work and tried to get me to write the best stories possible. And really, I again wouldn't. I might have stayed there longer, but what occurred at Kotaku was this was during the Gawker era. The Hulk Hogan lawsuit was ongoing while I was there. And I distinctly remember during the summer of, I guess, the spring of 2016, my wife was pregnant with our first child, who's 4.5 now. And I remember watching like the suit resolve itself, where the trial jury, issued, Hogan, awarded him $100 million. And I remember like actively just like crying while watching the live stream, because I had just put a down payment on a house. I had bought a car, and I had a kid coming into the world in roughly 2 months. And I was, at that time making the most money between my wife and I. And so I felt like a real obligation to be able to provide, as we'd made a bunch of big bets about our future, both financially and personally. And suddenly I'm staring at a job that, bankruptcy is not a 24-hour process, but you try to avoid working for a company going through bankruptcy. It doesn't like make you feel comfortable day to day. And so that spurred me to start looking around, to start poking around for another job, because even though nothing in media is assured, basically if you go somewhere else, you kind of like restart the clock. And it's like, all right, well, I probably got like 2 years before I got to worry about if this job is going away. So I would like to restart my 2-year clock. And that was the motivating factor. And so around that time, I was weighing options between going to work at Rolling Stone's very short-lived Glixel website, headed up by John Davison, who did a lot of work at Ziff Davis and What Up and the magazines there, and Vice Games, which would later become Waypoint. I actually interviewed for the EIC position at Vice, knowing that I didn't want it because I couldn't move to New York, but I was like deeply flattered that someone was like, wow, like, do they think Patrick could run a website? I was like, I don't think I could. I don't like being in management positions. I like supporting other people's visions, and I like writing and reporting, and you end up getting away from that when you get into management. So like I did enough of the interview where I got far enough along in the cycle of it to be like, I should be honest. Like if this involves moving to New York, I gotta be like, I'm not gonna. I was like, I just bought a house. I'm about to have a kid. Like I'm not going anywhere. So that cycled that down. But they were like, do you have other people you think we should talk to? And I was like, well, if you really want like a really interesting choice for an EIC, like you should talk to someone like Austin Walker. Like I think he would be. It was like that and a couple other names. It was like Austin's a terrific observer, commentator, writer. Like just that would really. If you said, hey, Austin Walker is heading up our games website. It's like having a black EIC who is as smart as him, like that would turn a lot of heads. And so like the fact that I'm not at all attributing that like A led to B, but the fact that Austin then did get hired, and then he reached out to me to be like, hey, do you want to come be my first hire? And I remember telling him specifically at the end of our like not really interview, but kind of like chat over like whether I wanted to come over and what we might be building. I said, I was like, hey, I got to be real with you. Like, did Vice, like at the end of my interview for the EIC thing, I said that they should hire you. Like, they're not forcing you to like do this, right? Like, if you wanted to hire someone else, like you should. This is very flattering. I'd love to work with you. I think this would be great. But like, Austin, like I'll turn this down if you want to go higher. So, and he's like, no. Like this was not something pushed upon him from some other management regime. He was interested in hiring me, but it just goes to show, sometimes how small this world is, and how fortuitous relationships can lead from one thing to another. And I continue to be, knock on fake IKEA would continue to be lucky in that regard.
Support for Overlode is provided by our incredible patrons. To support us and receive access to perks and exclusives such as Patreon-only video series, check out patreon.com/overload or click the link in the description. Thank you.